back in our express days, myself and Martyn had a fantastic night if we'd done 300 shipments, in the centre of the UK. Nowadays, 30,000 is a bad night.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, folks, we're on for a Simply Trade podcast show, and it's going to be a good one here. I'm sitting down with Martyn Palmer and Martyn Noble, both from the UK. We're going to be talking about some U.S.-European trade relations or current situations. It's going to be a little different than what we've been talking about, but getting a more of a European perspective, especially from fellow Brits there that are, or brother Brits, should I say, not fellow. But I miss going to England. I got to tell you, it's been a long time since I've been over there, and had a fantastic guy that taught me how to drive while in England. And I thought, while I was over there for a couple of weeks, I thought, I'll get an automatic. I should be fine. It's opposite for the U.S., instead of the right side of the road, it's the left side of the road as far as driving and whatnot. And I'll be John Brown if I get over there. And there are very few automatic cars in England, and they're all stick shift. And so I'm having to now, and I had the patience of Job of a guy, his name was Andy also, and he taught me how to drive in England, and it was fantastic. But I was having to drive on the other side of the road that I'm used to and grab gears and shift gears with my left hand. And thank God the pedals were still the same. And I'm sure it's always goes back and forth. And people always talk about, Americans going over to, England and driving. It's just the same coming back the other way. But, of course, most of the cars here are automatics, which simplifies it a little bit. But all that to say, it was a great time. And here's one of the things that the U.S. and the UK actually was one of the first countries in the new administration here to actually pen out and agree to a trade agreement. So that's one thing that's good. There's a lot more, but there's a lot of angst right now within the EU. There's a lot of discussions about Europe. Let me rephrase that. Countries within Europe that are not really aware of what the EU is negotiating right now. So there's some questions that I've got on that. On the same token, there's like all this chaos. I mean, everybody's plan for the year, everybody's budget for the year has been blown to smithereens within less than 3 months. So it's like you had the best laid out plans, and here you go. So with that, we're going to have a good discussion. And I was teasing my guys here. My guest is like, okay, this is my brother Martyn and my other brother Barton. Some fantastic guys. All right, so I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves. So let's start with Martyn Palmer. Why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll go over to Martyn Noble.
Okay, cool. Martyn Palmer. I'm one of the co-founders of Hurricane, which is Hurricane Commerce, which Martyn I'll leave him to explain a bit more about that in a few moments as to what we actually do. My background's the supply chain. It's all I've ever done. That's a lie, actually. I worked for a bank for 6 months in my late teens, early 20s. But apart from that, it's always been involved in the supply chain. And for most of that, the express integrator side, in the days when we used to talk about the big four, FedEx, UPS, DHL, and TNT, I was in TNT, now part of FedEx. I guess my speciality has always been customs and compliance. I looked after the global clearance operation for TNT for many years and stopped my relationship with corporate life back in 2014. 2016, Martyn and a bunch of other colleagues from the past got together and we kicked off Hurricane, which I think is a great segue for you, Martyn.
Yeah, thank you. So Martyn Noble, CEO and co-founder of Hurricane. And just put some colour to what Martyn was saying there. You know, myself and Martyn go back 30 plus years when we were working for that express logistics company called TNT. He was on the operations side, I was on the marketing side. I latterly then moved through DHL, went into some other things, ran sort of operations of 4,000 people, budgets of 385 million. And then, you know, very similar to Martyn, 39th birthday, which was a few years ago now. So I had enough of corporate life and went off on my own, but fell into this thing called this very strange world called private equity and corporate finance. Normally were, and it was a different world then, you know, because you had these sort of like 3-year, 5-year plans, and never the twain shall meet. And you had to crack your return on investment within those 3 or 5-year tenures. Anyway, opened a business completely outside of express logistics or cross-border trade. It was actually in the music industry, and later exited that. So my sons thought I was very cool at the time, and then went into this thing called Hurricane. And basically put the band back on the road again, to use the music link. Got the band back together, bunch of grey hairs, but surrounded ourselves by tech. And you know where Hurricane is really our strength is literally about that data, and getting the data that can start on a shipment order. It can then go into all the customs documents and the fields on those customs documents that you require. And the way the world is at the moment, if you get that wrong, you know, compliance isn't really optional. Shipments slow down, customer dissatisfaction, potential fines, increasing fines. Governmental authorities are getting better and better and better at the forensics and tracking through where some of the mistakes are and who the regular offenders are. The fines are getting bigger. The regulatory stuff is getting bigger. And that's really where Hurricane helps out. You know, it's a tech company. We sift data, we screen data, we make data more accurate for that cross-border, that customs process. And we've been going way too long now, haven't we, Martyn? 9 years. Seems to have gone, and you were referring to this. It just seems to have gone. Oh, 9 years have gone. And we're in a very, very good space at this moment in time due to chaos.
Well, and with that, I will say that you're hitting on some key things that as we talk through, we've talked here on the show with a lot of companies that have a similar system or a process and one now where you're gathering data from multiple sources and going through. But here's one of the key things, and that is, there is the old, it's an old adage, believe it or not, is the garbage in, garbage out type thing with computers and as far as data goes. And if your data is accurate, look, your shipments, your processes can go through like greased lightning. And if your data is it's not accurate and there's conflicts in there, then it would screw up a 2-car parade in a 1-block route. So with that, I would say that it is paramount, especially in today's world with now so much change going on regarding, the tariffs and the requirements for any exceptions, or for that matter, getting down now, other things are being looked at with even more scrutiny. Whereas before you would have a country of origin with, based off of substantial transformation. So, components come from all over the world and they go into a particular factory in a country. And now they're assembled and whatnot. And so all these parts, the one that's probably utilized most is like a bicycle. You got parts, tires, rims, chain, sprockets, frame, all that coming from multiple sources. But when it all comes together now, it's no longer the parts thereof. It's a bicycle, and it's transformed into that. Is no longer necessarily the only thing as far as, okay, the country of origin, let's say in this case, may be the UK. But it's like now you have to get into, from a compliance standpoint and all that, is, well, what is the percentage of country of origin of the components? So it puts a whole nother, level of bureaucracy that people are having to look at. So, this is one of those things where I guess I'm looking at it, and as we're trying to gain through this, let's back up a little bit before we get into too much of the details of, minutia of compliance and international trade. Let's back up a minute. Just in general, obviously Trump was elected in November. And in January, obviously January 20th, he took office, and it has been a whirlwind. Now, Trump's not messing around here. I will say with that is that he is moving forward with an agenda on a lot of different fronts. With that, though, what is, from the European perspective or the UK, either one that you want to speak to, what's the general sentiment? I think it's shock and awe right now with a lot of people, but you're having to move quickly, and the UK did move quickly with going ahead and getting a trade agreement signed. So what's y'all's opinion right now with the current situation?
Andy, if you step back, myself and Martyn have sort of talked about this. If you actually step back, and I look back, Martyn, to, when Hurricane was just a discussion over a pint of beer, and a kernel of an idea. And, I think, some of the mega trends that we identified, and this were 9 years ago, Andy, 9 years. And, those mega trends were around, the geopolitical environment of the world, no matter where you wanted to go, US, Europe, pre-Brexit, for the UK, Australia, some of the Southeast Asia companies. That geopolitical environment was becoming, there was this slow ebb, becoming more and more nationalistic in its policies, protect its borders, protect its own manufacturing base. I think the second mega trend was around increasing regulation and more regional and local regulation. And, in the time since we started Hurricane, there's been more regulatory change. Okay, some of that has been spurred by wars and, conflict in Ukraine, so on and so forth, but increasing regulation around lots of stuff, components or elements in foodstuffs, to where how safe is a product to import into my country, and it becomes more and more complex just to maneuver. Go back to your bicycle example, just to maneuver either parts of that bicycle or pre-assembly, full assembly, export import of that bicycle. And I think that's really the details of that regulatory change and the depth of that regulatory change has been brought about by digitization. That whole, when me and Martyn first started, sorry to take you back, old man, but when we started, it was basically a box, a pallet, and a piece of sticky tape with an airway bill that was there was 7 parts to that airway bill, all carbon copied, and stuck. One of those parts was stuck on the pallet or the parcel. The other was sort of like went into billing, administration, customs, so on and so forth. And these sort of like hard copy printed commercial notes. And in that sense, that was very much a manual process. And over those 30 years, they've been automated, semi-automated, utilization of technology. Pre-advice used to be done on this thing called, half of our listeners probably won't know what a telex was.
What, the telex? I was going to say, you're going down the telex.
Yeah, man. But your pre-advices and your IATA commands were basically done through that mechanism. So we fast forward to now, and all of that process automation, semi-automation, full automation, digitization has enabled more and more complex regulation, and it's sort of almost dehumanizing the process in a way, but also the volume shifts. Back in our express days, myself and Martyn had a fantastic night if we'd done 300 shipments, in the centre of the UK. Nowadays, 30,000 is a bad night. So the scalability has changed as well. So let's take that context and then start bringing it down. And whilst I think, a lot of the tariff announcements, the tariff policies, so on and so forth, Trump has got the headlines. But coming right to your point around the EU, they've been looking at changing some of this stuff for many, many years. You had the VAT de minimis reduced back in mid-2022, Mark? Yeah, mid-22. Yeah. And the VAT de minimis. And, you've got the customs reform coming up for 2028, which is zero de minimis on the value of goods, and duty as well. So whilst Trump has got the headlines, there's just been this slow trickle, quite long tier policy going on, and that's not just Europe. That's around everywhere else. I think, with the Trump element, it's the shock and perhaps the manner in which it's happened. But then you start to see the reverse flow of the tide coming back, where a lot of these governments around the world are now saying, well, he's done it, so maybe we can as well. Mark, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, going back from our history, the companies we are involved in, we were always working with the WCO and the WTO and the likes. And it was always about trade facilitation, making it simple to trade internationally. And, the likes of the de minimis, fantastic thing. I think, the US was the first country to kick off de minimis back in 1930. But, the concept that it shouldn't cost $1 to collect 50 cents, is quite a logical, reasoning as such. And in many ways, those rules were written for a time when e-commerce didn't exist, when there was no side of the COVID pandemic on the horizon, and the growth that's come from that. And the volumes, I think the US hit 1.5 or 1.4 billion low value e-commerce shipments last year. The EU hit 4.2 billion e-commerce shipments coming into, and bearing in mind we've got a de minimis of 150 euros, which is a lot lower than the US de minimis of $800. So the world's a totally different place, and it needs to be managed in a different way. And as Martyn alluded to, going back to 2018, we saw Australia remove the de minimis on their GST, and New Zealand have done the same, and Russia have decreased theirs. And now we see it being almost a common game. The EU customs reform had this as removal of the de minimis, all as part of their plan, which they announced nearly 24 months ago now. So it's been coming. But as Martyn said, President Trump has just come in and fast-tracked everything. And it's a bit of a shock. But as we always say, If your house is in order at the start, and you know your commodities, you know where they're made or they're constructed or they're produced, you know the different elements that are going into that, you've got your data right and clear, you've got your customs classification right, and you've done your sort of routing on duty rates, and you understand what it's going to cost you buying a product in a certain country, you can minimize the negative impact on this. You know, no, I was just going to say that it's the variables that come in. And, you know, as we see it, it's frustrating, and, you know, we're constantly having to make a lot of changes, but we're changing the variables. The structure is there, and we need to work with the variables.
Well, and to that point, that's so important, because the data in international trade is the same. It's there. You may even have to get a few more data elements or more detailed in certain things, but the data is still there. The question is how much do you have to use for release purposes versus confirmation on the back end in your payment of duties and taxes or compliance. But out of all this, the one thing I will say, now this is going to be a personal statement. I think it's a major mistake on countries eliminating the de minimis, because again, the issue there is that it costs the government, let's say, you know, as you said, you know, it costs $1 to collect 50 cents or whatever it is. And so many countries have looked, and the governments have look at all this revenue we're losing, but they're not looking at it holistically, like what's the cost involved to collect it. Now, saying that, I will also then say that, especially in the U.S., is that the de minimis has been abused in the e-commerce world by certain countries. Now, here, let me just digress here a little bit, and I'd love your opinion on this. In the express industry in particular, we were just talking, and all of us have a deep experience and background in that. With the express, we had to provide electronic manifest and had it in advance. And we had to have, when the physical shipments arrived, there had to be, you know, systems that electronically would track every single box, account for every single box, so that, you know, if customs or another agency made a selection to do an exam or something, that box would be pulled to the side versus the others, you know, already had been processed, the entries had been done, a low value had been done, and all that. One of the things that we get into is de minimis. And for those that don't know, de minimis is one of those items as a shipment is valued so low. We said we threw out 150 pounds there in the UK, I guess. And that's anything valued less than 150 is considered de minimis, meaning so low, it's not worth a full entry kind of thing. I'm oversimplifying it, but it basically can stream through and it's cleared off of the manifest, as we would say. In the US, it was raised from $200 up to $800. But the point being is all those thousands and thousands of shipments in the past would require an entry to be submitted and or transmitted into custom systems. So it's clogging the system with thousands of entries for these low dollar items. And so you would have let's say in theory, a $600 shipment had an entry go in, and you would have $100,000 shipment and the entries in there. So in theory, I guess electronically, the 100,000 is behind the $500 shipment, but it's all getting processed. Saying that, is it worth the time and effort? Well, now where the deal is that with the Express, we had to pay, reimbursables, had to have customs there and do that. Well, then you have the Sheins and the Temus and the other companies that took advantage of that, predominantly out of China, and it hit all over the world to everybody's de minimis in this e-commerce world. But what I can't understand is customs did not require them to have the same kind of equipment, information, and all that advanced stuff. So all of a sudden, these containers would show up, and these massive, massive loads of of these low dollar shipments, and then they were basically being processed almost manually. And I'm like, well, now wait a minute, that's a double standard. And so then there's this influx, and all these customs and governments are going, oh, we can't handle this. This is getting passed through, almost like the post office kind of thing too, as well. And I'm like, if you required the same that you do of the express carriers that specialize in streamlined clearance of those low dollar shipments, then I don't think we would have near the problem. Plus, they could still collect the revenue off of the taxes and all that. But I don't know. I know we digressed a little bit there, but that's, in my opinion, what's happening is now the pendulum is coming so far back. Guess what? All those low dollar shipments now, there's going to be a lot of individual entries having to be prepared and submitted. And just think about it. It's going to, I don't care we have great electronic systems, but it's going to clog that system with an onslaught of data of these low dollar shipments while you're trying to get these big, massive shipments cleared, these ships and containers and all that. So I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, it for me, I guess the thing that's frustrated me most over the last sort of 6 or 7 months is the term de minimis loophole that seems to have come about. And there's been a sort of, it's almost been inferred that, it's clandestine activities that are going on behind the scenes. But we've got to remember with all of this that, that there is a lot of very legitimate, very professional organizations out there that are just selling things. And how they get imported into a country is really defined by that country's government as such. And, if they want an $800 de minimis level, they can have an 800 or an 8,000 de minimis or an $80 de minimis level. It doesn't matter. That's for that country to define. But, we shouldn't, there's a saying in the UK, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In my opinion, which is, similar to what you were saying, Andy, it's the surgery is too severe. And, it's finding that right balance act. And the thing that really gets to me is we've been talking about our past careers. Where we came from, we had customs in-house. We had electronic systems giving them full data declarations to customs in advance of the shipments arriving in the countries. We had customs examinations. We had controls in place. And we validated the data before we gave it to anybody. Now, for me, one of my biggest frustrations is that this is, in my opinion, the net result of the inability of being able to enforce to carry out proper enforcement and risk management on those huge volumes of shipments. And it's almost that we're having to really stop everything just to manage a few bad actors out there. And that seems a little severe to me.
Well, with that, let me ask this question. Where we're at now, and obviously, the pendulum is swinging. With the trade law or trade battles that have been going on, I mean, I will say this. From a personal standpoint, my opinion is U.S. goods have not been treated fairly around the world for decades, okay? Now, there's always been battles, don't get me wrong, between U.S. and the EU, especially in the aerospace industry, Airbus versus Boeing and all these things. And that's a hot topic right there. Now we're even getting into some challenges with space technology and manufacturing medical devices and things of that nature. Now, saying all that, as we're finally getting, and again, I come back to the UK, US trade agreement, Europe, there's going to be, I strongly believe there's going to be some kind of an agreement that's hopefully going to resolve some of this tension back and forth and finally get it down to where let's talk about commerce between countries, between continents and all of that so that it is more free flowing, but it's however you want to debate it, fair game. I see opportunities for businesses, in this case, both in Europe and in the U.S., because at least on U.S. goods coming in, but also the reverse of that, and a lot of goods coming back and forth. So where do you see, with what you're seeing right now, the opportunity? You see that where small businesses and small manufacturers are going to really, I think in the next 9 months, it's going to be this explosion of manufacturing and commerce between, countries here. What do you think?
Already, Andy. I see, if I sort of very simplistically layer organizations, big ones, middle ones, small ones, right? And within the larger OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, I'm already starting to see subcomponent manufacture and analysis shifting, or plans, I should say, plans to shift around the globe around this period of turbulence in tariff. And it's almost a knee-jerk reaction, because what global commerce needs is a period of settlement to readjust. It doesn't matter what the levels are. Business always adjusts over time, and the three of us have been around the block long enough to know it always settles. When we were all in Express roughly around the same time, we had to deal with interest rates turning on a dime back in that period of the early 90s and the mid 90s, and the impact that had on currency flux. And we were in express operations, so we'd focus on selling X work, so imports coming in, particularly if your currency got weak, as opposed to the normal outbound export. And that's what we did. And I think the larger organizations, you've got a lot of that happening at this moment in time. Do we shift it from China to India? What's the mapping on that? I don't know. For example, an electric motor for some form of small domestic appliance or something. So there, mid-market, medium-sized companies, I'm actually seeing them, and I can divide those into sort of like three camps. Those are, we've got to modernize, we've got to digitize our processes, we've got to get the data right first time, right up front, we've got to change our payment terms, no surprise, to DDP, yeah, and we've got to be compliant, and we see compliance as a competitive advantage of our firm working in our market. And that's something we can probably scriff a margin on. Yeah. And then there's the third bucket, the second budget, which is lots of running around but not going very far. And then there's the third bucket is let's wait and just see what happens. Okay. Smaller companies, and don't forget, I talked about mega trends earlier on. The generations after us, they're far more in tune with buying from SMEs. It's easier to set up businesses, and that world trade. Just think about what marketplaces have done, and if you think about B2C e-commerce. 60% of the global transactions, all that low value stuff Martyn was talking about earlier on, is traded through a marketplace. Now, we can't expect them to be absolute experts in going back to when the three of us started at splitting the 8-copy airway bill and filing it. And so, we knew the end-to-end process. And I think it's wrong that we should expect them to do that. Operators need to really think about where this growth in the next 20 odd years will be coming from. And it'll be coming from the entrepreneurial spirit, the SMEs, the micro businesses, so on and so forth, because their reach is so vast now. You think about, again, if we go back to the sort of like the 80s, the only advertising we had was billboards, bus shelters, direct mail, and telemarketing. Now you think about it, it's all about social media. It's all about LinkedIn. It's all about the web. It's all about digital content type stuff. And where will it be in another 20 years? So, in that respect, their reach, they can be absolutely, some of the stuff we were taught when we were first starting in our careers. When you're small, you want to appear big. When you're big, you want to appear small.
Folks, we're going to have both Martyn's contact information on our show notes, and that way you can reach out to them with questions and things. They are phenomenal. These guys will forget more than I'm going to get to learn here as far as this international trade goes. Listen, Martyn Palmer, Martyn Noble, thank you so much for being on the show. You guys have been great. This is a good discussion, and I'm sorry we're having to cut this off for now. But it's like we need to do some more of this as we're going through, and I'd love to get an update as you see some things as being negotiated and agreed to with the EU. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I absolutely. I mean, there's a bit of sort of animosity. So today, what are we? We're Friday, the 23rd of May, just as a reference point. And, there's some clear animosity coming out from the White House to the lack of progress from the EU with the talk of 50% tariffs being applied from the 1st of June. But I'm sure that'll all settle down in the fullness of time. But absolutely, there's an awful lot to talk about. And, where we tend to focus as non-Americans on the American import market, as you were saying earlier on, it's a great opportunity for domestic U.S. manufacturing organizations or whatever they are to sell overseas. So perhaps there's another opportunity to have a chat about how to sell to Europe or how to sell to Australia or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that would be excellent, matter of fact. Well, guys, you guys have been great. I appreciate you. Folks, we also, I want to say and take a moment just to say thank you so much for liking and sharing our show. Contact us on LinkedIn. Again, just make your comments. If you get any comments for any subjects that we want to cover or whatever. I got to tell you, I'm sitting here going, himma, humma, whatever. It's like, I don't know what the heck's wrong with me. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. And folks, we hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.